There is a new young chess player taking the chess world by storm. His name is Ramesh Babu Praggnanandhaa. Forgive me if I didn't pronounce that correctly. He is from India, part of the surging chess culture that's going on in India. So many strong young players. Pragg is the fifth youngest grandmaster in history. He's the youngest player to have ever beaten Magnus Carlsen while he was the sitting world champion. He is currently 16 years old, and in our game today, he is playing Super Grandmaster Teimour Radjabov in the NIC Classic Preliminaries. This is 15 minutes for each side. Let's begin. Praggnanandhaa has the white pieces. He plays d4. Radjabov plays knight f6, c4, e6. We know Radjabov likes to play the King's Indian, but he plays a little bit safer in this game. Knight f3, d5, knight c3, bishop to e7. A mainline Queen's Gambit declined. Black wants to just castle, play the knight, b to d7, maybe c5, b6, bishop to b7, get a comfortable position. Pragg, instead of playing bishop to g5, probably the most common move there, he decides to play bishop to f4, gets the bishop outside the pawn chain and clamps down on the e5 square, which we'll see is going to be important. Castles, e3, knight b to d7, and now he plays c5. And the usual way Black counters this c5 move is with the move e5. But he can't play that here because the bishop at f4 helps clamp down on the e5 square. Knight to h5 going after the two bishops. Bishop to d3, knight f4, ef4. Now the pawn helps control the square e5. Now Radjabov attacks the front of the pawn chain because he cannot attack the base. He plays b6, attacking c5. Pragg defends with b4, a5, a3. And then Radjabov plays the move c6, and the reason he plays this is because white is threatening to play c6 himself and gain critical space on the queen side. Obviously, a move like knight to b8, b5 would completely shut down the queen side, but even after pawn takes, knight f6 and b5, white would have a huge advantage, and Black cannot allow that. So he plays c6 himself first, and castles. So this bishop on c8 is a problem for Black. He's got to get rid of that because it's a very bad piece. He wants to play bishop to a6. First, he plays queen to c7, hitting the pawn at f4 after g3 defending that pawn, then bishop to a6. Bishop takes, rook takes, but now queen to e2. And the queen hits the rook at a6, but also creates x-ray pressure down the e-file. If Black were to, say, play rook f to a8, then b5 is a possible move. Pawn takes, c6, queen c6, knight to b5, and white is threatening to play rook to c1 and to penetrate onto the 7th rank. If Black were to preempt that with, say, queen to b7, then f5, taking advantage of the pin along the e-file. The pawn cannot be taken because the bishop at e7 would fall, and if it instead rook to c8, Sam Shanklin gave some analysis here. Rook fc1, takes, king g2, rook a8, f5 again, rook c6 to defend, pawn takes, rook takes, and after queen to a2, the knight is threatening a fork at c7. The d5 pawn will fall, and white's d4 pawn will become a monster. So instead, he plays rook to a7. A better move was probably rook a to a8 to keep those rooks coordinated. He plays rook to a7. Now f5, threatening to open up pressure down the e-file. bc5 is what Black would like to play. But unfortunately, it doesn't work very well because after pawn takes, queen e6 check, king h8, queen takes e7. If this rook were on a8, it could come here and Black would be well coordinated. But the rook on a7 isn't well placed, and after rook f3, king g2, rook f6, pawn takes, white's in very good shape with the queen at e7 causing all kinds of trouble. So instead, he has to play pawn takes, pawn at b4. a4, rook a1, and now e5. And it looks to the eye like Black's doing okay, but there's a brilliant move coming up. After knight e5, Pragg now has a clear advantage, although it's not clear why yet. Knight takes, pawn takes c5. Now here, if white just took on c5, Black would be doing fine here. But it is this next brilliant move, which had actually been played one time before by current world number 2 Ding Liren. It's this move, b5. Very, very impressive. And what the idea is, after d4, which is what was played in the game, the follow-up, b5. F6. It is a pawn sacrifice designed to deflect the queen away from the king side. And after queen takes b6, as was played in the game, knight to e4. And the pawn sacrifice has allowed white to have all of these strong pieces. He's got this really nice pair of pawns on e5 and f5. The knight is aggressively placed, the queen. The rook is on an open file. Well worth a pawn. White is doing well. In the Ding Liren game, his opponent played queen to d8, but that would allow f6, and white's attack would really get rolling. So Radjabov played f6, knowing he was allowing his opponent a protected passed pawn, but killing the mobility of those pawns. And e6 is what Pragg plays. It turns out the computers say queen to c4 check is actually the way to take advantage of this position, and then you put the queen into the heart of black's position. After e6, the computers say that position is technically equal, but that is ridiculous. Clearly, you'd much rather have white here than black. It's not even close. Queen to b5. Radjabov would love to trade off those queens. Pragg was not going to allow that to happen. Queen to d3, queen to a7, counterattacking the bishop. Queen takes knight, queen takes e7. Queen takes f5. Obviously, white wants to play the rook to a7. But if he plays it immediately, then black has a perpetual check with queen to b1 check, king g2, queen goes back to e4. So to prevent that perpetual, Praggnanandhaa plays h4 first to give his king room to move out away from the checks. Queen to g4, defends g7, now rook to a7. h5 prevents back rank threats. Rook to d7. Now, if black could hold tight in this position and sort of do nothing, he might be able to hold the draw. How can white break through is the question. But Radjabov decides to go for the counterattack, and that's what really sinks him. He plays rook to a8, but now white has a winning variation. Can you see it? That's right. He plays rook to d8 check, forcing the exchange of the rooks. Queen takes d8 with check. King h7 is forced, and now e7. And there's no perpetual check, and there's nothing black can do to stop the pawn from queening. Radjabov resigned in this position. After queen d1 check, king g2, there are no more checks, and that would be it. So a brilliant game by Ramesh Babu Praggnanandhaa, and we're really looking forward to many great tournaments and games from him. Thank you for joining us at Chess Dog. See you again soon. Bye.